Afternoon, everybody. We shall get going. My name's Michael Duffy, and this session is called You Find a Dead Body, What Now? I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and the traditional owners of the land and pay respect to any elders, past and present. I've got a lot of housekeeping here. Is there anyone who hasn't been to a previous session? Here? Oh, there are. In that case, I'll read it out. Bear with me. Please mute your mobile phones. Don't record the session. If you're taking photos, please turn off your flash. Feel free to share on social media at Bad Crime Sydney, hashtag Bad Crime Sydney. And I think that's about it. We are going to take questions, yep, so we'll talk for about 45 minutes and then invite questions from the audience. Okay, so we've all read in books or seen on TV what happens when a corpse is discovered, usually by someone walking their dog if it's an English program. Today we're going to talk to two experts about what really happens next. For example, does a forensic doctor always attend the scene, and if they do, are they as delightfully colourful as the people you might meet on Vera or Endeavour? And does the investigation involve two people going around in a quaint vintage car asking people questions, or is it a bit more complicated than that? You probably know the answer, but you probably don't know exactly what happens. Do the doctors always say when asked for the time of death, I'll need to get him onto the slab, but at a guess it was 2:35 this morning. Mick Willing is a former Deputy Commissioner of the New South Wales Police Force and was their longest serving Chief of the Homicide Squad. He now heads a private consultancy called the Pelian Group. And you got a new, do you want to talk about anything else that you're doing?
Just been appointed CEO of Fortum Australia. I'll give it a plug. An independent non-for-profit that helps first responders and national security personnel with mental health, well-being and career transition. So really important organisation.
And Xanthé Mallett is a forensic anthropologist and criminologist at the University of Newcastle and an author. She co-hosts the podcast Motive and Method with our friend Tim Watson-Munro sitting in the front of you, and the YouTube series Inside Crime, The Experts. Can you please join me in welcoming our guests? Mick, just to give us an idea of scope, roughly how many murders occur in New South Wales each year that we know about?
So murders, as aside from manslaughters, as aside from suspicious deaths, there's always been around about 80 in New South Wales, and it goes back a long, long way. It's always sort of been relatively consistent. There have been periods where those numbers have diminished, probably due to medical advances and those sorts of things, but in general, there would be around about 80 as a ballpark figure.
Can I ask a question? Has the pattern of types of murders changed over that time?
Good question.
The motives, I mean.
Lots. Probably 40% of those are domestic and family violence related, maybe more. So a lot of those. No, generally not. You know, from my experience and understanding, you know, you've got that cohort of maybe 10% that or less that are stranger-related murders, and the rest of them, people know each other in some form or fashion.
Sorry, it's another detour, but why is it staying at 80? You think it would have gone up with the population? Yeah,
look, conversely, coming down or being maintained at that level due to, again, medical advances, keeping people alive and those sort of things as well. I think there's a lot of different factors.
Xanthé, on TV, many bodies seem to be found by people walking their dogs, as we know. What's it like in reality? Is it possible to say where most murder victims are found? For example, houses, parks, whatever?
Oh, no wonder Mick started laughing. Yeah, like that is a big question. Where they're found is really relates to, there will be so many factors, situational factors in that. Like if it's a DV-related crime, a lot of it is going to be in the home, isn't it? So, right. Because they're normally unplanned, it's just something that happens in the moment. Some of them are more premeditated, but a lot of them happen in the home. If it's a stranger killing, it could be somewhere outside, parks, so the location is totally dependent on the instance of the crime. So I think it'd be really hard to say where they're commonly.
Yeah, I agree. There is no sort of real, this group are generally here, there, but if common sense would dictate that if 40 to 45% are domestic related, a fair chunk of those are in the home.
I mean, if it's a pattern crime, you can use geographic profiling to estimate, where something happened or where a body may be, but most of them are one-off, so that's not going to be as relevant.
Mick, what should a member of our audience do if they discover what they think is a dead body?
Or what shouldn't they do?
Don't touch it.
That's our tagline for today. Don't touch the body, unless they're breathing.
So
then-
it's again a really broad question, of course. But generally, if you come across a body, just say, well, I should take a step back. Every scenario is different, right? But first and foremost, preserve life, and that's if there's a chance of somebody's alive, do what you can to preserve life. Talking before this session, somebody suggested, what if I get my DNA on the body? Well, so be it. Tell the police, what you've done. So generally preserve life. If the person is clearly deceased, you don't touch it. Contact police. Take my first. I guess what I would do is take as many notes as possible. Now, okay, nobody walks around with a pen and paper as well, but remember details, because you're going to have to be interviewed at some point and provide as much information as you can about what you find. Preserve the crime scene as best you possibly can, if it's a crime. I mean, we're assuming this is a crime. Preserve it as best you can. And I know that there are circumstances that come up, well, I've got to take off, I've got to pick up my husband from the train station or something like that. These things happen, but as far as possible, we need to stay at the scene.
And presumably the person or someone there will ring 000. What happens in the next few hours as far as the police are concerned?
I think Xanth was going to say something before. But
All I was going to say was a lot of the time people will also cover the body.
Yeah.
From a forensic perspective, I would suggest you don't, because that's interfering with the scene.
Yep.
So, you don't need, I know that seems respectful, but you're actually adding evidence or contaminating evidence at that point. So just don't touch anything. There was a question. Oh, gosh, see, we knew we were going to get curveballs, didn't we?
I guess that will lead into what will happen with police. So police, you ring police will turn up. It will generally be uniformed police officers to start with, who will establish a crime scene or cordon off an area in some form or fashion. If it's raining, they will make arrangements to have even set up a structure over the top of it. That takes time. Yeah, could do that. Whatever's required to preserve the scene as best possible, they will do. If there are signs of suspicion, and that could be anything from what the body looks like to the circumstances, where it's been located, the circumstances in general around it, detectives will be called. There is a standing agreement that goes back some time with the state coroner and New South Wales Police that detectives will attend all suspicious deaths, which you would understand. If it appears suspicious, an investigation will kick off. Now, there's a whole bunch of things that come with that will pull apart.
Roughly how many officers are in the homicide squad?
There are around 100. The homicide squad, I think they're getting more now, and they could triple it, to be honest, and not keep up with the workload. When I had it between 2011 and 2017, there were 6 on-call teams of 10 detectives each, who would rotate through a roster every 6 weeks, and they would get absolutely smashed with work. And then there was an unsolved homicide team as well, and then there was an intelligence component, so intelligence analysts, and then a couple of staff around supporting the commander. So around about 100.
Okay. Xanthé, apart from the police, what other professionals usually attend a crime scene, and what are they there for?
Oh, again, that's a big question. It really depends on what the crime scene is and what is required. So my personal area of expertise would be forensic anthropology. So if skeletal remains were found, for example, the first question is normally, are they animal or human? And whilst that might seem really obvious, if remains are fractured or fragmented, it can be difficult to tell. If the skull is intact, it's usually obvious the pelvis, but other long bones, for example, can present very similarly between humans and some animals. So it can be difficult for the public and the police to tell initially whether they're human or not. So you may need a forensic anthropologist, you may need an archaeologist, you may need a geophysicist. There could be any number of experts you would require depending on the scene. And it's not only in relation to the body, but you may need experts to help, biomedical experts to help interpret a scene afterwards to see whether the injuries could have been actually obtained in the way that a suspect might suggest, for example. So it could be anything far over and above those that would collect the trace elements, so the DNA, the fingerprints, the hair and fibres, all of that. So it's very scene dependent.
I've experienced all of those experts at various times coming and going. So the homicide squad has a database of experts that they would contact and call depending on the circumstances.
Does the doctor who will do the autopsy normally attend a crime scene?
Another good question. They can do. I think it's usually valuable for them to attend the crime scene because I think you need to see the situation to try and understand how those injuries presented or lack of injuries, whatever it is. So I think it's very useful for them to attend. Obviously, seeing the body as quickly as possible is obviously useful for them to capture as much information as they can. But you're right that they won't give anything away until they've completed their examination, and that's completely right. They're not going to start guessing at that stage. But equally, they're not going to give you a time of death, 2:35 a.m. this morning. They'll give you a window depending on the temperature of the body, the climate, whether they were clothed or not, what the season is. All of these things will affect how quickly a body cools, for example, and therefore the likely time of death within a certain number of hours or days or weeks, or you may go to months or even years.
Yeah, it's always preferable that a forensic pathologist turns up to the scene. It doesn't always happen. So generally what would happen is, the detectives are there, crime scene forensic examiners would turn up to the scene. So police officers who are trained in forensics turn up, take control and record the scene as best they can. Depending on the circumstances, the pathologist may come out, and again, good if they can, but it's sometimes very difficult. But they would record the scene, police would record the scene as best possible, take samples, and then there's a whole bunch of things occurring around the scene as well, in terms of gathering data. Now, electronics like obviously CCTV, phone data, there's a whole bunch of things that are occurring at the same time as an investigation.
Are they using 3D imaging of crime scenes now? Yeah, because I imagine they capture a lot more information that can then be recreated.
Yes, really, really good technology being used. Probably the first time I saw it really, really being used and beneficially was the Link Cafe siege and the crime scene that was examined the next day, which, I went to that. And it was an amazing reconstruction of what occurs.
So how does 3D actually operate?
Well, it's. I'm not a technology person, but it records the scene, and it's virtually like a court can be in the scene.
Sort of like a camera.
Yeah.
It's like a camera on a tripod, and it does a 3D image, and I think it's a light source, and it captures the whole thing like multiple photographs basically that it builds into a 3D image. So literally you can walk a jury through that scene, you can put in evidence, take it out, demonstrate bullet trajectories, all that kind of thing.
It's like you're there.
Yeah.
We might just hold the questions to the end from now on, if that's all right, simply because most of the rest of the audience can't actually hear them, so they don't know what the question was.
We can just repeat the question.
No, that's all right. I noticed some of our audience here today are taking notes, which is fine. I did a session for Bad last year on how to get away with murder, and a lot of people were taking notes there too, so maybe creating a bit of work. Yeah. Xanthé, autopsies, how important are they, or can they be?
Autopsies are incredibly important, and I've seen a lot of cases that are assumed to be non-suspicious to start with. For example, suicide, full autopsy is not done, just an outer autopsy, and then later on it's determined that it could have been suspicious and that person's already been buried or they've already been cremated. So the autopsy is essential, and the pathologist needs to be competent, because if they don't capture that information, then it's lost. And I'm thinking specifically of Colin Manock now, down in Victoria, who did about 10,000... I can say that. No, it's been through the courts. I do not need... South Australia, sorry. I thought you were going to tell me to say allegedly. No need. No need. He did about 10,000 post-mortems and he had 0 qualifications in forensic pathology. People went to prison that shouldn't have done for decades, and people who didn't go to prison should have done. And there are a number of very infamous child death cases with long histories of evidence of ongoing healed trauma that he determined were natural causes. So post-mortems, absolutely essential, but absolutely have to be done by somebody competent, and the results have to be replicable. So they have to collect enough samples, images, so that somebody else can review that if that's necessary later.
Yep. And don't get your DNA test done in Queensland.
That's a can of worms, that one.
On that too, you think about it. The victim can't talk and can't tell you what's happened verbally, but they can forensically. So incredibly important.
Mick, is it possible to say roughly what proportion of murders are real puzzles, like TV-grade puzzles, and what proportion are there where the police turn up, the detectives, and after a day or so, they've got a pretty good idea who did it?
That's another... if there was a simple answer to that, I'd give it. Very hard to say. There are generally... I believe that generally police, like profilers, they get a gut feel of what's happened. And I do believe that. And they may not eventually gather the evidence to prosecute someone necessarily, but they generally are pretty on the money about what's happened. There are cases that are complete puzzles, but absolutely complete puzzles. There are very high-profile cases that are complete puzzles. Now, I won't compromise anything, but there's a 10th anniversary of one right now.
But fortunately, most criminals are not that smart, are they?
That's correct. Yep.
So when you have a whole team of experts with a huge amount of experience, knowledge, training, and then you have all of the experts they can draw on, it's very difficult for one person, no matter how smart they think they are, to actually outmaneuver that, no matter how well planned. So fortunately, most of them are in the moment and most of them leave evidence behind because they're not that clever. And even the clever ones, it's really hard to get away with it because of the expertise that's leveraged by the police.
Think I often reflect back on Jack the Ripper and how long it would have taken to solve that with modern technology, and given the fact that it was such a small geographic area and all these different things that have occurred, I think he would have been locked up, or the person would have been locked up pretty quickly. But you do get cases where you pretty much within a few hours you know exactly what's happened, and you can take action. But then it's sort of one door closes and the court process starts. So there's a whole bunch of work that comes after that.
Xanthé, is it possible to say if there was a murder tonight,
What are you going to do?
Statistically speaking, is it possible to say what's the most likely relationship that person might have to their murderer?
Well. Who's been murdered for a start?
Well, let's say it's a woman, a married woman.
Well, if it's a married woman, I imagine you would look at the husband first, any other close relationships, you would certainly do all of that. But, obviously Mick would know more, but stranger crimes are the hardest ones. Like the literal, random victim, that does happen. But if it's in someone's home, there's no evidence of break-in, no evidence of struggle, you're certainly going to be looking at people they knew, somebody they let in, somebody they trusted. So, that one is likely to be looking at something domestic.
Yeah, one of the pillars of any homicide investigation is victimology, right? So learning everything you possibly can.
The course I'm teaching at the moment it's literally called victimology.
There you go. So you everything you literally pull apart that person's life to work out everything you possibly can, and then some, because people may interact with people on a train station that they don't know. There's a bunch of things that can come from that. And you're right, the stranger ones are really difficult. But you need to expand out, and that's where there are a number of arms of investigation, including, again, technology, forensics, victimology, a bunch of things that come into play in terms of identifying who it may have been that committed the act.
And even if they didn't know the victim per se, it may be somebody they came across very superficially or works at their university or something that knows the victim.
Yep.
So you have to look at all of those relationships too. You may have a stalking situation the victim may not even know. So it's about really building their life and picking it apart.
Yep. Seen exactly those scenarios.
And how do you go about setting up an investigation in real life? Because in TV, it's often pretty simple. And in terms of resources, for example, and everything else you need, the number of people, how big a job can it be, and what are some of the main things you have to put in place?
Again, another good question. Every case is different, but so there's a first response that occurs, say a local investigative response. As I said, if it's homicide squad are notified of every suspicious death or every homicide. In New South Wales, they generally will send resources. So the on-call team, the inspector from the homicide squad is the decision maker who will say, okay, I might send 2 detectives out to that if they're available of their team, or monitor over the phone, depending on the way that the job evolves. But in a general sense, the homicide squad would team up with local detectives and set up an investigation structure. That means kicking off what we call an investigation, given one of those silly code names that everyone comes off a database, and actually set up the parameters to electronically start recording the investigation, evidence, statements, etc. So there's an electronic process. You would appoint someone to be, I guess, the lead person leading the investigation. That could be the inspector, depending on the circumstances, but generally it's probably a sergeant or somebody more junior. And then the resourcing, it's you throw as many resources as humanly possible at a job to begin with. And then there are processes in place within New South Wales Police to get detectives and other support staff from surrounding commands, if it be the case, to actually supplement the investigation. In terms of the structure,
What sort of numbers could we be talking about?
it depends on the job. It depends on how high profile it is. It depends on like, say, for argument's sake, an organised crime homicide where it's an extremely well-known person, it's going to be a long, hard investigation. So a lot of resources are thrown at it quickly, and it depends on availability too. I've had cases where my entire homicide on-call team's been burnt out. They're tied up with jobs completely, particularly if you get a death in a police operation matter type thing. So they're completely taken off, and you've got to pull other resources on to try and pick up the slack. There are structures that are put into place. Somebody would be allocated to lead dialogue with the victim's family. Somebody would be, in charge of the crime scene. Somebody would be charged of conducting a canvass. So one of the basics in homicide investigation is getting out and actually door knocking, and finding out whether somebody heard something or saw something. Somebody would be in charge of gathering all of the CCTV and other electronic pieces of evidence as well. So there's a whole sort of structure that's stood up pretty quickly.
I'm getting a picture of possibly thousands, if not tens of thousands of pieces of information coming in. How do you keep on top of all that?
Well, hence the database, the electronic database, and I've got to say, the databases that are currently being used are pretty old. There needs to be investment in upkeep of those. But generally a database where systems and processes are electronically set up to record and categorise information as it comes in, allocate it for follow-up, and those sort of mechanisms are the way that you record the information. The databases are searchable as well. So you can search for a name or a description or a number plate and those sorts of things. So.
I imagine it must keep the officer in charge awake at night. I mean, the possibility that one of those pieces of information has been overlooked or not connected, and it could be crucial.
Oh, absolutely. I'll tread lightly here, but I remember having some dialogue with more than one inspector about stop generating and doing media at the moment because you don't know what you've currently got in your holdings. We need to, the answer sometimes has always been there. It's a difficult thing, but when you're trying to generate leads at the same time.
Where do you see AI coming into that then in the future? Because I can see patterns being picked up by computers much more quickly.
Absolutely.
Than by officers overseeing that. So I can definitely see some benefits.
There are absolute benefits. Again, like the true crime debate, there's got to be some ethical parameters around the use of AI. But there are some real benefits that will come. Now, I remember a particular organised crime murder. There was a series of them by a bunch of people in southwest Sydney, and I think there was something like 800 hours of CCTV that had to be, this is not that long ago, that had to be viewed by a detective every single minute. Stop, pause, go back, and months and months and months of resources. Now, that could be done and reviewed in a minute.
Yeah, and I see it for serial offences where certain patterns would be very obvious to a computer. Very quickly identify pattern.
Yeah, the problem is, in my humble opinion, law enforcement agencies, they know they've got to adopt AI. They know they've got to move into that space. The problem is maturity. I think from what I saw in the private sector, that there are other law enforcement agencies around the world that are a little bit more advanced than where we are. We're treading carefully, understandably, but data and holdings needs to be clean. It's all based on what data you've got, because you can get some pretty skewed results in some of that stuff. But yeah, absolutely critical. It'll be just like DNA in the future.
Speaking of DNA, Xanthé, what are some of the big forensic developments in the past, 50 years or so? Obviously, DNA is one of them. Yeah. And also, we started off talking about that number of 80 murders a year that hasn't changed much. Do you think they have made it easier to catch criminals?
I think it's certainly easier to catch them. If you think about all the technology we have now, all the forensic techniques we have now, the tiny, tiny amount of DNA that's required now to identify a victim or to identify an offender that, years ago we couldn't. So certainly we've made it harder. I mean, if somebody murdered me later, I wear a Garmin watch, it's got GPS in it, it'll tell you when my heart stopped. So, literally pinpointing time of death, if you can capture that information, which the police can get access to that. CCTV, I mean, everyone's got mobile phones. There's so many different types of data, but I think in a way that makes it harder to start with, filtering that amount of data. Yeah. So we've certainly made it harder, yes.
So I think, and technology like AI catching up to the big data pools that you have to gather is a good thing, because we were able to capture the data, but then it took so long to analyse the data. So, you're right. Like, everyone's got a phone, everyone's trackable. I think it makes it very difficult to get away with murder nowadays. Now, there are other reasons that people get away with murder. But in terms of an investigation, again, I go back to Jack the Ripper. Would the person have left DNA? Yes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. If they were such violent crimes, they would have left their traces all over it.
Absolutely.
Mick, how important are phone taps and listening devices?
They're still important, and I say still because they're still used. Getting direct confessions and things like that from telephone intercepts is increasingly hard because everyone knows. But some people still talk and say things on phones, and some people still say things that are recorded via listening devices. I think, whilst direct confessions and those things are, they don't always happen, they're very good to build an intelligence picture around somebody, like a person of interest, or you learn more about them, so you can watch the patterns of what they do, how they go about things, and then try and connect that to a crime scene. Obviously the reason that you get a Supreme Court warrant or a federal court warrant to get the devices in place is to capture incriminating evidence and or exculpatory evidence as well. But there's a bunch of benefits that come from it.
And ultimately, I think that well, anyone who's being listened to or thinks they may be being listened to forgets after a while. And obviously all calls that go into prisons are recorded. And I've heard many instances where they forget and they're talking in what they think is code, which is really very obvious code, because I go back to them not being very clever. And they give away all sorts of things that help solve crime. So, yeah, I think that is can be a really valuable source of intelligence.
Okay. I'll ask you this, Xanthé, and maybe Mick can add something to it later. Let's say our investigation has proceeded and we've got a person of interest, and on TV the detective just walks up to them or drags them into a police station and starts asking a series of questions. But in real life, is the approach a bit more subtle on that? And what do you do to prepare for how you're going to approach that particular person? I imagine there's a bit of psychology involved, at least.
Oh, I think Mick would be better at this. But from my perspective, whenever I would talk to anybody, and I've talked to going to prisons, etc., it has to be matched to the individual. You might play to their ego. You might try and engender some sort of level of trust. You might be a bit more dynamic. It really depends on how you think you're going to engage with that person.
Yeah, that's right. Where you have the time, a lot of planning will go into that first interaction with a person of interest. It could be a bunch of different ways of doing it, and Xanthé's right. There could be playing to their psychological characteristics. It does work. You get more from more with honey.
And sometimes you might send a female.
Yeah, totally. Oh, yeah, absolutely. We used to do it quite regularly and send female detectives from the homicide squad to speak to some very infamous killers that were doing life in jail, because you play to different, play to egos, you play to different psychological, characteristics. But generally, a lot of planning. The person or the detectives who would be speaking to the person of interest would have to have a plan. They've got an interview plan ready to go. They know what they are trying to achieve by doing it, and it's generally as staged as best possible to get, as much evidence as possible.
Well, I've heard of police doing things like planting certain media stories before they interview someone, or even if they've got their phones tapped, because they're curious to see what the person of interest might actually say or how they might respond to that. Does that been known to happen?
Oh, it might.
Would that be called chatter?
The previous session that we're in with Tim, and Mark Murray from the Telegraph was here, we were talking openly about using each other, and that happens quite regularly. Sometimes it's a cause and effect thing. So, police will work with media to get certain messages out, or to try and spark conversations, or to disrupt relationships to the point where you can, wedge people from suspects and witnesses to try and get information. So, yeah, it happens quite all the time.
And speaking of the media, have you got any thoughts on the extent to which they're both a hindrance and a help?
Yes, he did, just now.
Look, they can be. And again, reflecting back on our last session, I've had cases or sat over the top as the boss of homicide of cases that you tear your hair out with some media about what they do. Some of them are really helpful, but generally the journalists, the media journalists, are good to deal with. You can work with them on a win-win situation for police and the journalists. Sometimes you just get, I would just call rogue operators who have their own agenda, and they don't really either care or understand how you can compromise an investigation.
But for what I've seen recently, there's been very clear media strategy. So Samantha Murphy disappeared around the same time as the Bola Marcondon alleged double murder in Sydney, and the police strategy there was very different. Like, New South Wales was very open, far more open than I've ever seen them, I think, be before, with what they were doing in the investigation, exactly where they were at. And I think that was with a view to being transparent, because the accused was one of their own. So they had to be transparent. Whereas with Samantha Murphy, it wasn't investigatively useful to be as transparent. And everyone kept, when I did interviews around that, why are they not doing anything? Why is it so quiet? Why aren't they working on it? I was like, just because they're not releasing information doesn't mean it's gone quiet. They're just not telling us. And it was a real juxtaposition, but showed very clear media strategy.
Yeah, that's right. So there are, at New South Wales Police State Crime Command, where the Homicide Squad rests, or sits, I should say, there are media officers attached to that, and who work every single day with you on how to, one, deal with the media, one, strategise. And sometimes you're right, Xanth, like you don't say anything and people will go, why aren't the police talking? There's pros and cons for all that. And it depends on the crime and depends on the circumstances. Yes, I think what happened with Beau Lamar Condon, allegedly.
Well done.
I think there are a few different things behind the scene about why they did what they did, but it was about transparency, without a doubt.
Xanthé, I know you're a podcaster yourself, but what do you think of those podcasts such as The Teacher's Pet that set out almost to solve a crime? I mean, what do the police think of that?
Well, I don't think the police were maybe that happy with it, but when I listened to it, and I don't normally listen to true crime podcasts, I did listen to all of that one, and I was concerned as I listened with how many times Headley would say probable murder, probable murder, probable murder. If you counted, it was thousands. And I thought, if this ever gets to court, that's a problem, because everyone who listens to this obviously knows that Headley thinks that Chris Dawson is guilty of Lynette's murder, and they will be of that opinion too, because it was very heavily influenced by that. But ultimately, and people will say to me, oh, well, they never would have charged him if it weren't for The Teacher's Pet. And actually, yeah, don't worry, I'm going to stick up for you right now. So 3 briefs of evidence had actually been delivered to the DPP, and they'd rejected the first 2, and I firmly believe they'd rejected the third one, which was submitted before The Teacher's Pet. Yet, because of the pressure, the social pressure that was leveraged as a result of that podcast, the DPP charged. So sometimes it looks like the police aren't doing anything, but they're getting blocked by the DPP. So
Thanks,
actually, and that's always what I've said. It's not because we're friends now. It's absolutely true.
It's quite true. I went to a meeting with the Attorney General, the lead investigator, and the DPP at Parliament House and begged for them to charge.
Yeah.
And there were things, and I'll tread carefully again. There are things.
I was going to do that. Yeah.
Well, there are allegedly things called directors' rules in the DPP, where one director wouldn't overturn a decision of a previous director, and that was what was at play. And it was like, come on.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, but what about this witness? You can't be reliable. Well, that's up to the court. We were actually arguing that stuff, and ultimately the decision was not to charge. And then way it goes.
So do you think without The Teacher's Pet that would have gone through, or do you think that pushed it? Because that was my impression, that if they'd said no at that third submission, they were going to have a lot of explaining to do.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. I mean, there's human nature in all of this as well. I, again, will tread carefully, but the Barraville murders, there was a real, the lead investigator, we all know Gary, very passionate about it, but it needed the whole squad behind him, everyone behind it, and going, this is the right thing to do, is to try and challenge that double jeopardy issue, and it was the right thing to try and challenge it.
Yeah.
Can I, on that issue of what you're going with the confession, I remember when I grew up, Detective Sergeant Bateman, in those days, the 50s of Sydney, he was...
Jack Bateman?
Jack Bateman, yeah. He went up to Darwin to pick up a criminal who was a suspect, and when they got on the plane, the suspect confessed, but it was all totally useless because he didn't caution him. And that without a caution, you couldn't in those days bring it into evidence.
Can you now?
Look, there are discretionary things, but generally no. But what you would do was, then if you can, interview the person and adopt it, and say, did you agree you said this? Do you agree? So you can, but then, lawyers get involved and all these things, so there's not many people who will...
It's become a bit looser.
So Mick, does the DPP, the Director of Public Prosecutions, always have to agree that someone be charged?
Nope.
No?
So, they've got, ultimately they can withdraw it, so ultimately it rests with them. But in terms of the charging process, sometimes matters go to the DPP for advice. To be brutally honest, sometimes it's a bit of offsetting risk around it too, and saying, okay, well, DPP, we believe there's enough there. What do you think? There have been cases where we have made a decision to charge very deliberately without going to the DPP. Point in case being family law court bombings. We made a decision because we felt that there was sufficient evidence to link all of the cases together and to charge the person who was eventually convicted, gone to jail doing life, Len Warwick. We did it with internal legal advice. We did it with everyone right to the top of the organisation agreeing. The reason we didn't go to the DPP is because of the workload that they carry, we'd probably still be waiting for a decision. And then I'm not being critical of them, but they take a long time sometimes to make those decisions. And this was there was so much pressure, and it was right, and we backed ourselves.
So why did they have such control over the Chris Dawson, the teacher's pet matter?
Because it was a case that wasn't as clear to begin with, and the case had been referred by the coroner to the DPP, and decisions had been made historically about it. If there was sufficient evidence to begin with, the charges would have been laid.
Okay. Just a very boring aspect of policing. You prepare a brief of evidence, don't you? Can you just give us some idea of the scale of work that can often be involved in that?
Wow. Well, I can tell you what it used to be. A brief of evidence was pretty small. But yeah, the scale of work now, you're talking terabytes of information. You can't physically... I've seen briefs of evidence you can't put in a room physically. So information, including not just statements, but records and video and all sorts of things that go into a brief of evidence nowadays is completely different from what it was when I was first knocking around as a young detective.
You can have 14 or more volumes, can't you? I mean, you can have a lot.
14's small. I recall back in 1995, a homicide trial I was involved in, there was 70 volumes then. That's, 30 years ago, almost. You're talking massive amounts of information.
So, Xanthé, is there a risk that this is just, we may get to the stage where this is just too complicated for many jury members to deal with?
Oh, I think we've kind of been there with a lot of forensic evidence for a while, in that it's highly complex, which is why you have experts who explain it to a jury, and they need to be capable and competent to do that in an accessible way, and sometimes that fails. But ultimately, that's why you can have dual experts. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of complication out there, and it's on the justice system to make sure the people who are reviewing that evidence, presenting that evidence, can do so in a way that is accessible to jury. But I do think that the legal profession could be more educated in some of those techniques so that they have better understanding, because I think that would help their questioning and help elicit the information the jury requires, and the judges too.
Yeah, great.
Is there any evidence to indicate how often juries get it right?
Oh, God. Well, we know that they get it wrong sometimes. Generally speaking, the right people go to prison, I believe. But we do know that a proportion are wrongfully convicted. So juries do get it wrong. But that depends on whether they got it wrong because the evidence presented to them was incomplete at the time. We may get new evidence, like in the Kath Folbig case. That's obviously the most recent one where the jury ultimately got it wrong, but they got it right based on the evidence that was presented to them at the time.
And the science.
And the science at the time, yeah. So, I mean, I always had a question mark over it because I think some of the evidence wasn't accurately presented, and there was some prejudices that kind of flowed into some of that evidence in terms of, how many children die within a family, what's the statistical relevance of that. But that was because the evidence was compelling to the jury. So the jury made, I think, the decision that any average jury would have made at the time. The fact is the science and the evidence misled them, unfortunately, and it led to a woman going to prison for 20 years for 4 crimes she didn't commit.
Totally agree.
And can you tell us about the innovation of judge-alone trials? When can you have a judge-alone trial? And is there any evidence to show if they get better or different results?
Well, they definitely get different. They definitely get different results. People are more likely to be acquitted of all charges with a judge alone, and so often the defence will favour a judge alone. They may push for it, especially in something high profile like Chris Dawson, because they will argue that it's not possible to find a jury of somebody's peers that's not been influenced by media reports or knowledge outside the courtroom, because the jury is charged with making decision with evidence that they've heard in court and only in court. So everything everything else extraneous to that should not be considered. But we're human, right? It's not possible to just switch your brain on and ignore everything, you've heard outside. So there is an argument, I think, for judge alone, but that really depends on the judge you get, doesn't it? Some judges can be very prejudicial against some types of cases. Yes. So I don't think it's a perfect solution. I don't think we have a perfect system, but I think it's the best one of the options available.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it is not perfect. Sometimes far from perfect, but it's the best non-perfect system we've got.
What about AI judges and cyborgs? You see that on the horizon?
Question asking if AI judges could be on the horizon, and would it be a good thing?
Oh, God, that's different. I think they could probably make decisions based on case law. Yeah, they could do that. But each case is unique, though, and my concern would be that they would fail to consider things outside of their learnt knowledge, which is only things that they've been trained on, ultimately. So I think that's a scary future, to be honest.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's technically possible, but one of the parameters that should be around the use of AI is there's got to be a human element, with it. There's got to be that ethical human element, and sometimes the final decision maker needs to be a human being, with all the flaws that human being has.
If you think about sentencing, how complex sentencing is with mitigating factors, factors that make it, more serious, then how could AI really weigh up all of those considerations? I think that would be very challenging to do, to add that layer of humanity and morals over the top when it's computer generated. But maybe that's where we're going, I don't know.
I've got lots more questions, but I'm going to pause after this next one and ask if anyone here would like to ask a question. But Mick, just one last thing before we do that. The role of the officer in charge during a trial. When I used to cover court cases as a journalist, I was impressed by how busy and how much work could be involved in that. Can you just give us an idea of what that officer has to do?
Well, I was going to swear then, but and say they get pushed around and told to do all sorts of different things. No, but look, an enormous amount of work. So the officer in charge really is obviously the conduit to the police brief of evidence, or the police force witnesses, etc., to the prosecution process. But they will be offline at trial every single day for the entirety of a trial. If that's 3 months, it's 3 months. If it's a week, it's a week. And they're the sort of things that you have to build into to managing like a squad, like the homicide squad. You go through periods where half the squad was sitting at the Supreme Court, because it just came around that way, and you've got to sort of make sure that resources are there. But they do an enormous amount of work, and they feel it personally too. They carry, from my experience, homicide investigators carry it with them, throughout the course of trials and well beyond as well.
Because it can all go wrong, can't it? If they make a slip up during the trial, all that work
happens, and there's mistrials, and you go back again, and all those different things occur, and witnesses sometimes give evidence and say things that they hadn't said before, or they change their versions, or whatever, can't remember things. So it can be frustrating, but it can be exhilarating as well.
All right then. We've got a microphone here for questions, so please, if you put your hand up, just up the back there, thanks. Right up the back on the left. We'll start there and work our way down, if that's all right.
Hi. What do you think are the most effective strategies for dealing with PTSD, given all the trauma your officers see? And what do you think could be done better?
Maybe one for you, Mick.
How long have you got? Look, I think that is a really complex issue in terms of the best strategies to deal with it. I think from my experience and understanding is a lot of first responders who develop PTSD, by the time they get help, they're broken. There are a lot of organisational factors and operational factors that contribute to PTSD rather than just seeing bad sights. So there's a lot of, I think, things that can be done from a leadership perspective and setting culture inside organisations that would help. Really complex. We've just seen the release of Royal Commission into the suicides of veterans. Exactly the same for police officers and first responders. Same contributors, I think. It's a big topic.
Hi, that was fantastic. I just wanted to backtrack to your 800 hours of CCTV and trying to imagine in today's world how you gather that CCTV. I presume you don't get it on a USB. Do you go in there and get it yourself?
Well, you used to.
Yeah.
That's if somebody hasn't sold it to the media first. But you literally go in and either one, you download it onto a USB or a terabyte, a large sort of mechanism to capture it, or you take the whole drive. There are ways of capturing it. And part of that too is, whilst I tongue-in-cheek talk about the media getting hold of it, sometimes you need to take it so you don't compromise, what's happening by it being released to the media. Saw that during the murder of Curtis Cheng out front of the down at Parramatta. I was the boss of homicide then, and all of a sudden there was some footage that was released by Channel 7, and we're going, where did that come from? We had it, and we actually were looking at each other going, has somebody leaked this footage? But as it turned out, there was money exchanged hands for some poor kid across the road had sold it, and we had to go over and go, hey, we need you to come forward and tell us what you did with that footage. These things, it might be frustrating for a shop owner or something like that, or a person who owns a building to have their CCTV taken, but it's a necessary evil sometimes.
One here and then we'll do that one. Do you want to do here first? Or? Yes, so this one. Hi. My question relates to lost evidence, because it's so common that you are watching a documentary and you say, oh, well, sorry, the weapon was lost, or one of the pathologists went home with a vial full of blood in their pocket. I'm researching a case at the moment in which a hair that was in the victim's hand and the semen sample and the knife and a rag that the killer wiped his hands on were all lost by police. Why is it so common? What are the common reasons for lost evidence happening? Like, surely they don't just get pushed off a desk and into the bin. Like, it's just so common. Why is that?
Hi. Look, I don't think it's as common as you think. Certainly the cases that have occurred have been high profile, and there's no excuse sometimes for exhibits and things going missing. Sometimes with historical homicide cases, exhibits were kept without even a foresight of what sort of technology or science was going to come in the future. Sometimes exhibits were destroyed without any knowledge of what, or foresight of what might come either. Sometimes it's just they're lost through pure incompetence, it's without a doubt. However, there are cases that I know of where exhibits have been located 30 years down the track, family law court being one in particular, where we're able to get blood from a piece of cardboard. That was the crucial link to the offender, and it all came together then. So I think systems and processes of exhibit management in the past were suitable to the time, if I can generalise it that way, without thinking about what might come next. So homicide exhibits in New South Wales have to be kept now. They weren't beforehand. So they were all gathered up, years and years ago, and actually centrally stored because somebody had the nous to go, hey, we don't know what's going to come technology-wise. But I don't think it occurs as much as what has been made out. But yes, there are high-profile cases that have happened.
How are they stored for me?
Forever.
Forever.
Is there a question on forensics, please?
Homicides.
We have a question on forensics, or any hands up? Maybe we'll just go to here, thanks. Just one for Xanthé. Okay, sorry. Okay, we'll do this one and then that one. How's that?
Look, one comment and one question. Comment, I wouldn't listen to the teacher's pet podcast because I had real doubts about the history of the fellow running it. He was detailed by the higher-ups at News Limited to do an expose on Julia Gillard. And it was obviously political reasons. And no matter how much effort they put into it, it drew a blank, except they had a lot of nasty articles. So I wouldn't have anything to do with something.
Moving
that he
on to
was
the teacher's
involved
pet, maybe?
in.
Yep.
Anyway, I suspect he did the teachers because he was trying to prove he was a better journalist than he had been.
Allegedly.
Well, allegedly. Yeah, I have still.
Is there a
got
question?
doubts.
Come on.
But the question is, to what extent do you think the trial judge in the Dawson case, Justice Harrison, made a difference? I mean, he's obviously a man of great experience and skill, but also he was a person who's prepared to chance his hand. Would a lesser judge, and this is obviously my bias about him, would a lesser judge have acquitted Dawson?
It's a hypothetical question. I don't think anyone can answer, to be honest, sir. I don't know.
Yep. How could you answer that? Is there a question about forensics over there, please?
Oh, it's not necessarily about forensics, but anyway.
Anyway, it's fine.
I'm just wanting to find out, Mick, from you, what effect in a regional or remote area, how does the homicide squad have a relationship with the local area command in a regional or remote area? Do they fly in? Do they stay around? What happens?
Yeah, exactly that. The tyranny of distance can be a problem, obviously. So you need to be in constant contact with the local detectives on the ground as the homicide squad's responding. It takes time to get out there, but I've had cases where homicide investigators are going back and forth out or staying or living out in a community for months, working with them. It's just part and parcel of what you do as a homicide investigator. And look, if need be, you get them on Pol Air and get them out there immediately, and done that before. Generally, the inspector of on-call homicide is liaising with somebody senior in a local area out in regional New South Wales where something's occurred, and ensuring that things are managed whilst people are en route. But generally there is no real difference other than the time it takes to get there.
Is there a question on forensics, please?
It's fine. I don't
I want to know more about forensics.
Hi. When bones are discovered, how long would you say it would be before an identification could be made?
Oh my God. Okay. Well, that depends completely on the context. It could be made very quickly if that person's remains, for example, even before you get the DNA, if a biographic profile, so age, sex, stature, ancestry, comes up in one of the databases against a missing person, it may happen quite quickly. But equally, there are hundreds of sets of remains around the country that haven't been identified for decades. So it depends entirely, and you could have the DNA and you can have the dental and you can have that biographic profile, and yet if they're not in that missing persons database, if nobody's reported them missing, then they will remain unidentified.
Sorry, just quickly. Do you do the facial recognition, like the reconstruction, that sort of thing?
That can happen in certain cases if the police deem that that's going to be useful. Certainly, I've known cases where that has been used. But that, again, it can generate new leads. It can be helpful for an investigation, but people can still go unidentified even when that happens. Thank you.
I could probably just add, if that's okay. So a couple of cases in point there. You can prioritise or have the Department of Forensic Medicine prioritise a DNA test, and we've done that in the past. And it generally just depends on how long the machine takes, to be honest. But it can be pretty quick in terms of a result. Other cases, and Xanthé's right, you can have everything under the sun, but for whatever technical reason, you don't identify the person. Case in point, Carly Pearce-Stevenson, who was Balangalo. She was Angel. It was a body that was found at Balangalo many years later. Her daughter was found in a suitcase at Wanaka in South Australia, and with Candelise, and we couldn't identify via DNA Carly because of the fact that the offender involved had made caused a phone call to be made where she'd been reported missing in the Northern Territory, and pretty sloppy work. They didn't follow it up properly, but they wrote the case off as she'd been found. And so there was, things like that occur. And so we were searching the world for whoever Angel is when she was really literally...
And a facial reconstruction was done in that case.
It was, yeah.
But I actually don't think it was very accurate, the facial reconstruction. When I saw it, when I saw the skull and I saw the reconstruction, I was like, anyway, that's another story. But it still didn't work because, nobody was really looking for it because proof of life messages have been sent by the offender.
We're going to have to leave it there. I think we've run out of time.
We'll
Sorry.
hang around. Well, you can ask.
We can chat a little
Yeah.
bit afterwards.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think we've learned today that if TV shows are even vaguely realistic, they'd be a lot longer than they are at the moment. Can you please join me in thanking our guests, Mick Willing and Xanthé Mallett? Thank you.
Thanks.